Oh, let's move on to how much do you care about 60 FPS on PS5? I have a follow-up article on this, but I wanted to ask, what is your feelings on 60 FPS? Do you think you're owed it? Let's hear it.
I was sold the PlayStation 5 on the promise of 60 frames per second. When I bought that console, I was told that the lowest games would run at would be 30 if you were running them at native 4K, but most of them would be able to run at 60. But you'd need a special TV to get more than that. I didn't have that special TV, so I knew 60 was the absolute maximum I was getting. If I had that special TV, I'd be aiming for that 120 all the time. Having experienced 60 frames per second, especially in certain genres of game, like a hack and slash title, a shooter title, even some action-adventure titles, dropping back down to 30 is physically painful. It makes me feel physically ill. I experienced this last week, jumping back onto the PlayStation 4. Destiny 2 in 30 frames per second. It only runs at 30 on the PlayStation 4, and it was painful to experience. I felt physically sick. I couldn't look at the screen properly. It diminished my ability to actually play the game. And when I've been sold a piece of hardware on the promise of 60 frames per second, that I will get to choose that in any game that I want, and there are then games coming out that won't achieve that, I feel like I have been missold something. That's £500 worth of console that I have been missold at that point. And you can call it an artistic choice all you want. It's developers not doing their job well enough. I was sold this, saying games would run at 60 frames per second if I wanted 60 frames per second, and then these developers are not living up to that promise. That's not a customer issue. That's not an issue that I have. It's an issue that those guys making it, both the hardware and the software, have in not delivering on promises that were made. I think 60 FPS is a minimum requirement for this generation. I do not think it is acceptable to ship something with less than that, especially with the promises made at the point of purchase.
I would have to agree. I mean, the reality of the situation is I haven't really experienced a lock 60 FPS in a story game since Horizon. I feel Forbidden West, it really held that 60 FPS and gave me the experience and buttery smooth gameplay. These third-party titles that I'm picking up, it mentions Final Fantasy VII in the article here, that 60 FPS actually did detrimental things to the performance of the game and made the graphics sort of unviewable in many aspects. And for that, I'd love to just see, 60 FPS the standard and have this output on games. Maker brings up that he loves 30 FPS on his Nintendo Switch for Zelda. However, that was built for that console. It was 100% optimized, and the graphics and the art style lent itself to 30 FPS. I think when we're moving towards more of that realistic, really eye-capturing, especially a game like Dragon's Dogma, I feel could have benefited from holding 60 FPS and made it buttery, crispy, smooth. But what we run into here is the fact that software is outpacing our hardware, or they're simply not optimizing, or they're missing a key in terms of translating it to really make it work. Whether that be budget, technology, or knowledge, it's got to be one of those things that's preventing us from getting locked 60 FPS. Or we were sold marketing. Unfortunately, we bought into it. Freaking blast processing.
I think there's a fourth one you can add in there as well, and that is a word that developers hate to hear, that is bandied around by armchair pundits regularly, but laziness. Like, you could make these games work at 60 frames per second. Like, the one that sort of sparked this conversation last week with a lot of people was an Xbox title, actually, which, according to a lot of leaks, is going to be coming to PlayStation in the future anyway, and that's Hellblade 2: Senua's Sacrifice. It's locked at 30 frames per second, and there's no reason for that game to be locked at 30 frames per second. Ninja Theory are calling it an artistic choice, but it doesn't need to look the way it looks. We've got to a point where we're pushing graphics so hard, so far, for such minimal games that the player doesn't notice and doesn't care about. And I think those are the two most important things. All this extra work that's increasing the prices of these games, that's stopping them reaching their 60 frames per second threshold, the player doesn't care and the player doesn't notice. If there's two things that the player isn't seeing or caring about, why are you bloody well implementing them? Get rid, lower your graphical level and fidelity a little bit. It's still going to look hyper-realistic. We had hyper-realistic games like The Last of Us Part 2 on PlayStation 4, last generation, 4 years ago. It still looks incredible if you just play that PS4 version of the game, let alone the PlayStation 5 version. There is no need for these games to be struggling to hit 60 frames per second on the hardware that they've got. This hardware is not going to change the entire hardware generation. These companies knew that coming in. They know what they need to do to optimize their title to run at 60 frames per second. And a lot of it is that they have made a choice to not bother doing that. Because you've seen it from modders who can do it. They took things like Gotham Knights at the beginning of last year and made that run at 60 frames per second on a hacked PS5. Okay, it's jailbroken firmware, but they could then mod that game and make it work like players wanted it to. If a member of the community can do that, highly paid, highly skilled video game developers can definitely do that.
Well, we have a lot of comments in here on the chat. Houston Aries says 30 FPS is mind-numbing playing first-person shooters. And the maker says that low-end PCs, when I bought my PS5 and X, I knew at some point we'd be getting more 30 FPS games as this generation continued. It's unfortunate. The marketing was really telling us that we'd be getting 60 FPS, and they just didn't deliver on there. But yeah, PS5 Pro may be able to hit 60. I believe the PS5 Pro is really just going to bring ray tracing to a lot of games. I think that's what its main thing is. If it does...
Turn that off too. Like, seriously. Going back to my previous point of stuff the gamers don't notice and don't care about, get rid of ray tracing and we'll hit 60 frames per second. There's enough power there. No one notices it.
Some people who use photo mode want nice light, all right?
Oh, Digims, all three of you.
Yeah, I want the ray tracing.
Rasmus want a good game.
I'm sure 60 FPS can be achieved with a game with enough work, but a lot of devs will have to determine if it's worth the effort. Right, and so that's where I feel like it comes to a pyramid of technology, knowledge, and budget, and then Dorgon's input there was laziness. But he has his perspectives. I think with money and budget, I mean, you can get laziness trumped there, but I digress.
You're right. If you've got the money to do it, you can do it. And like spending 200, 300 million on a game, why am I not getting 60 frames per second? That is money not well spent at that point. And this is where the corporate issue of game companies at the moment comes in, because it's all being spent in the places that gamers don't give a flying frell about. Yes, Farscape terminology for any sci-fi nerds out there.
But